Mrs. Parker, would your mother like to continue the monthly transfers to Daniel's account? The young woman behind the bank desk asked the question so casually that at first I thought I had misheard her. I looked up from the paperwork in my hands and stared at her. Beside me, my mother, Margaret Parker, blinked in confusion and adjusted her glasses. What monthly transfers? I asked. The employee's smile faded. For a second, nobody spoke. The silence felt strange, heavy somehow. I'm Evelyn Parker. I was 68 years old that spring, and I thought I knew everything important about my family. I was wrong. Looking back now, I can point to that exact moment as the beginning of the story that changed everything between my brother and me. The bank was only a few miles from Mom's house, a small brick building we had been visiting for years. That morning had started like any other. I had driven over to help Mom review some paperwork she had been putting off. At 89, she was still living independently, but lately she had been forgetting little things. Nothing dramatic. A misplaced set of keys. A birthday she remembered a day late. The kind of moments that make you slow down and pay closer attention. We sat together in the waiting area while a customer service representative gathered her account documents. Mom seemed relaxed. She chatted about the flowers blooming outside her kitchen window and whether she should plant tomatoes this summer. The conversation felt ordinary, comforting. Then came that question. The monthly transfers to Daniel's account. My brother's name hung in the air. Mom frowned. I don't send Daniel money, she said softly. The employee looked surprised. According to the records, the transfers have been active for quite some time. I felt something tighten inside my chest. Daniel was my older brother, 64 years old. The golden child, according to everyone who knew our family. He was the one who called Mom every Sunday. The one who always volunteered to help with repairs around the house. The one everyone described as devoted. If money had been moving between their accounts, surely there was an explanation. There had to be. Could we see those records? I asked. The employee hesitated. Of course. A few minutes later she returned with several printed pages. I watched as she placed them on the desk. Numbers. Dates. Transfer amounts. My eyes moved slowly across the page. Every month. Like clockwork. Funds leaving Mom's account and entering another account associated with Daniel Parker. I looked at Mom. She looked at me. Neither of us spoke. Do you remember authorizing these? I asked gently. Mom studied the papers. Her hands trembled slightly. No, she whispered. I don't remember this at all. I wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe Daniel had been helping manage a bill. Maybe there was some investment account. Maybe there was paperwork we had forgotten about. But the more I stared at those pages, the less comfortable I felt. The transfers weren't small. Some were several $100s. Others were much larger. Enough that I began mentally adding the numbers together. The total was already making me uneasy. Outside the large front windows, cars passed through the parking lot under the bright morning sun. Inside, everything suddenly felt cold. I thought about the past year. Mom mentioning that her savings seemed lower than expected. Mom worrying about expenses she had never worried about before. Mom saying she might skip replacing her aging refrigerator because she wanted to be careful with money. At the time, none of it had seemed unusual. Now every memory felt different, like puzzle pieces shifting into a new picture. The employee gathered the papers into a neat stack and asked whether we wanted copies. I immediately said yes. Mom sat quietly beside me. Her eyes never left the statements. As we prepared to leave, she touched my arm. Evelyn, she said softly, why would Daniel need my money? I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But as I looked down at the transaction history one final time, I noticed a note attached to one of the most recent transfers. It was only a few words long, just enough to make my stomach drop. At that moment, I realized I wasn't looking at a mistake. I was looking at the beginning of a secret. And for the first time in my life, I was afraid of what I might discover about my own brother. The drive back to Mom's house was unusually quiet. Margaret sat in the passenger seat staring out the window as rows of maple trees and neatly trimmed lawns passed by. Normally, she would have commented on every flower bed and every dog walker we saw. That afternoon, she barely spoke. The folder containing the bank statements rested on the seat between us like an unwanted guest. I kept glancing at it at stoplights, half expecting the numbers to somehow rearrange themselves into something harmless. They never did. When we arrived at her small white ranch house, the one she and my father had purchased more than 40 years earlier, she moved more slowly than usual. I followed her inside and helped her settle into her favorite chair beside the living room window. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily. The sound seemed louder than ever. Mom folded her hands in her lap. "Maybe I forgot," she said after a long silence. "At my age, people forget things." I sat across from her and shook my head. "You might forget where you put your glasses. You do not forget sending thousands of dollars every month." She looked down at the carpet. That answer did not comfort either of us. As the afternoon sunlight stretched across the room, memories began surfacing. Over the past year, Mom had mentioned her finances several times. Small comments that had seemed insignificant at the time. She had postponed replacing her water heater after it started making strange noises. She had canceled a landscaping service she had used for years. Last Christmas, she even returned a sweater she liked because she said it was more expensive than she wanted to spend. None of those decisions had alarmed me. My mother had always been practical. Now those memories felt different. They felt connected. I opened the folder again and reviewed the statements line by line. The transfers stretched back farther than I expected. Month after month. Consistent. Organized. Deliberate. Whoever set them up knew exactly what they were doing. What troubled me most was that Daniel had never mentioned any of it. My brother loved talking about how much he helped Mom. Family gatherings usually included stories about errands he ran or repairs he completed. He never once mentioned receiving regular transfers from her account. Not once. That evening, after making Mom some soup for dinner, I sat alone at her kitchen table while she rested in the next room. Family photographs lined the walls. There was one of Daniel and me as children standing beside our father at a county fair. Another showed Mom smiling beside a birthday cake years before her hair turned silver. Looking at those pictures made everything harder. Daniel was not a stranger. He was my brother. We had shared holidays, losses, celebrations, and decades of family history. The idea that he could be hiding something from Mom felt impossible. Yet the statements were sitting right in front of me. Facts do not care about feelings. Around 8 o'clock, my phone buzzed. A text message from Daniel appeared on the screen. "Just checking on Mom. Hope everything went well today." I stared at the message for several seconds. Then I read it again. Something about the timing unsettled me. We had not told him about the bank appointment. As far as I knew, he had no reason to ask about it. I typed a simple reply saying Mom was fine and left it at that. A few moments later, another message arrived. "Let me know if she needs anything." I set the phone down. The room suddenly felt smaller. My eyes drifted back to the paperwork. Then I remembered the note attached to the recent transfer, the one I had noticed before leaving the bank. I pulled out the statement and read it again. This time I paid attention to every detail. The note was brief, almost forgettable. But the more I looked at it, the more one question kept repeating in my mind. If Mom never authorized these transfers, how did Daniel know exactly when they were happening? The next morning, I woke up before sunrise and drove back to Mom's house with a knot in my stomach. I told myself I was overreacting. Families misunderstand things all the time. Paperwork gets mixed up. Banks make mistakes. Yet none of those explanations felt convincing anymore. When I arrived, I found Mom standing in the kitchen making coffee. She looked tired. The events of the previous day had clearly weighed on her. We sat together at the small oak table where she had served countless family meals over the years. Neither of us mentioned Daniel at first. We talked about the weather, about a robin building a nest near the porch, about anything except the question hanging between us. Finally, Mom looked at me and asked, "Do you think your brother would do something dishonest?" I stared into my coffee. It should have been an easy question. For most of my life, I would have answered immediately. No, absolutely not. But now I hesitated. That hesitation frightened me more than anything else. "I do not know," I admitted. The words felt heavy. After breakfast, I began organizing the copies of the statements. I spread them across the dining room table and arranged them by date. The pattern became impossible to ignore. The transfers were not random. They happened regularly, almost like a salary. Whoever created them had intended for them to continue indefinitely. Around noon, I decided to call the bank. Rachel Collins, the branch manager, remembered us from the day before. Her voice was professional but kind. I asked whether there was any way to determine how the transfers had originally been authorized. She paused before answering. "There may be supporting documents in the archive," she said. "I cannot discuss details over the phone, but you and your mother can request a review." That was enough to keep me moving forward. Later that afternoon, I drove Mom to a grocery store. As we walked slowly through the aisles, something unexpected happened. A neighbor named Carol stopped to say hello. During their conversation, Carol smiled and said, "Your son Daniel is such a blessing. He is always talking about how much he helps you financially." Mom looked confused. I felt my pulse quicken. Financially? Carol continued speaking, completely unaware of our reaction. "He told my husband that supporting a parent can be expensive, but family comes first." Mom forced a polite smile. After Carol walked away, neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, Mom whispered, "I never asked Daniel for money." Neither had I. That comment followed me the entire drive home. That evening, I began looking at things differently. Small details I had ignored for years suddenly stood out. Daniel had purchased a new luxury pickup truck last summer. He and his wife had taken 2 vacations to coastal resorts in a single year. He recently renovated his kitchen with high-end finishes that cost far more than most families could comfortably afford. At the time, I assumed he had been successful with his investments. Now I found myself wondering where the money had really come from. Before going to bed, I reviewed the statements one more time. My eyes landed on the note attached to that recent transfer. The wording seemed ordinary at first glance, but one detail bothered me. The message referenced a conversation that had supposedly occurred just 3 days earlier. According to Mom, she had not spoken to Daniel that entire week. I checked her phone records to be certain. There was no call, no voicemail, no message, nothing. I sat back in my chair and stared into the darkness of the living room. For the first time, I was no longer trying to determine whether something was wrong. I was trying to figure out how long the deception had been happening. 2 days later, Mom and I returned to the bank. The sky was gray and heavy with rain clouds, matching the mood neither of us could shake. Rachel Collins greeted us personally and led us into a small office away from the main lobby. A thick folder sat on the desk waiting for us. The moment I saw it, I knew we were about to learn more than either of us wanted. Rachel explained that the transfer history extended back nearly 4 years. For years, I felt my stomach tighten. At first, the amounts had been relatively small, a few $100s here and there. Then they gradually increased. By the second year, thousands of dollars were moving regularly. By the third year, the transfers had become substantial enough to noticeably reduce Mom's savings. Rachel carefully opened the folder and began reviewing the authorization records. Some of the transfers had been established through documents signed in person. Others had been modified electronically. That detail immediately caught my attention. My mother barely used a computer. She still preferred handwritten notes and paper calendars. The idea that she was logging into online banking to make complicated account changes seemed unlikely. Rachel must have noticed my reaction because she quietly nodded. "That question occurred to me as well," she said. She slid several copies across the desk. I studied the signatures. At first glance, they appeared genuine. The handwriting resembled Mom's. But the longer I looked, the more uncomfortable I became. Certain letters were shaped differently. The spacing seemed unnatural. Mom leaned closer and adjusted her glasses. "That does not look right," she whispered. "I would never write my name like that." Nobody spoke for several seconds. The only sound came from the air conditioner humming softly above us. Rachel then showed us account access records. Most of the online changes had been made from a device registered within our county. That alone proved nothing. Thousands of people lived nearby. Still, it narrowed the possibilities. Before leaving, I asked for copies of everything legally available to us. Rachel agreed and organized the documents into a large envelope. As she handed it to me, she hesitated. "There is something else," she said carefully. She opened the folder one final time and pointed to several emergency contact forms. Every account update listed the same secondary contact, Daniel Parker. I looked at Mom. She looked stunned. "I do not remember authorizing that either," she said. The drive home felt even longer than before. Rain tapped against the windshield while questions circled endlessly through my mind. Why would Daniel need to be listed on every form? Why had none of this ever been discussed with Mom? Most importantly, why did every new document seem to strengthen the same disturbing possibility? That evening, I spread the paperwork across my dining room table. Page after page formed a timeline. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Nearly every major transfer increase occurred shortly after a financial event in Daniel's life. A vehicle purchase, a home renovation, a vacation. The timing was too precise to ignore. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang unexpectedly. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it before finally answering. His voice sounded cheerful, almost unusually cheerful. He asked how Mom was doing. He asked whether she needed groceries. He asked whether I had plans for the weekend. The conversation felt strangely rehearsed. Then he casually mentioned that he might stop by Mom's house the following afternoon. Something about the comment caught my attention. We had not told him about the bank meeting. We had not told him about the records. Yet for some reason, he suddenly seemed very interested in checking on Mom. After we hung up, I sat alone in silence. The rain continued outside. The stack of documents remained spread across the table. I picked up one page and looked again at the sequence of dates. That was when I noticed something I had missed before. One authorization form had been submitted on a day when Mom was recovering from a medical procedure at a clinic nearly 40 miles away. According to the bank record, she had supposedly signed paperwork in person that same afternoon. I knew that could not be true, because I had been sitting beside her the entire day. The next morning, I pulled out an old storage box from the hall closet and began searching through medical records, appointment summaries, and calendars from the previous 4 years. I was looking for one specific date, the day the bank claimed Mom had appeared in person to authorize account changes. It did not take long to find it. The clinic paperwork was still neatly filed in a manila folder. There was the appointment confirmation. There was the treatment summary. There was even the parking receipt from the medical center 40 miles away. Most importantly, there was my own handwritten note reminding myself to stay with Mom for the entire afternoon because she would be tired afterward. I sat at my dining room table staring at the documents. The timeline was impossible to ignore. According to the bank records, Mom had supposedly signed paperwork at a branch office shortly after 2 o'clock that afternoon. At 2 o'clock, she had been sitting beside me in a recovery room drinking apple juice and waiting for discharge instructions. Both things could not be true. I immediately called Rachel. She listened carefully as I explained what I had found. Her tone became noticeably more serious. She asked me to email copies of the medical documentation. Within an hour, everything had been sent. The waiting that followed felt endless. Around lunchtime, Mom called. Her voice sounded worried. She told me Daniel had stopped by unexpectedly that morning. My grip tightened around the phone. What did he want? I asked. Nothing specific, she said. He just wanted to check on me. The answer did not reassure me. Daniel rarely visited without a reason. According to Mom, he spent most of the visit asking questions. Had she been feeling well? Had she needed help with bills? Had anyone contacted her from the bank recently? That last question made my pulse quicken. What exactly did he say? I asked. Mom paused. He asked whether the bank had called about routine account reviews. I leaned back in my chair. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Daniel should not have known anything about account reviews. We had told no one except Rachel. Yet somehow he seemed nervous enough to bring it up himself. Later that afternoon, Rachel called back. Her voice was calm but direct. She had reviewed additional records connected to the disputed authorization. The signature page contained information that had not appeared in the copies we originally received. Specifically, there was a witness field. Someone had verified the identity of the person signing the documents. Do you know the witness? I asked. Rachel hesitated for a moment. Yes, she said. The witness listed on the form is Daniel Parker. For several seconds, I could not speak. I looked out my kitchen window at the quiet backyard while the meaning settled over me. If the records were accurate, Daniel had personally participated in the authorization process. If the records were inaccurate, his name was still attached to paperwork connected to missing money. Either possibility led to the same place. Rachel continued speaking, explaining procedures and documentation requirements, but my thoughts were already racing ahead. I remembered the expensive truck, the vacations, the renovations. I remembered every conversation where Daniel proudly described his financial success. Most of all, I remembered how often he told everyone that family should always take care of family. That evening, I drove to Mom's house. We sat together on the back porch as the sun slowly disappeared behind the trees. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, she looked at me and asked a question I had been avoiding for days. Do you think your brother knew exactly what he was doing? I stared out across the yard. For the first time since this began, I no longer doubted that something was wrong. The only thing I still did not know was how deep the truth really went. For the next week, I stopped looking at Daniel as my brother and started looking at him as a puzzle I needed to understand. That shift changed everything. Instead of focusing on what I felt, I focused on what I could verify. Every document, every date, every transaction, every explanation. I built a timeline across my dining room table. Pages covered nearly every surface. Bank records sat beside medical appointments. Property records sat beside family calendars. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. It was not the picture I wanted. It was the picture that existed. The first thing I discovered was that Daniel's financial success had not been as steady as he claimed. Public records revealed a series of refinancing agreements on his home. There were liens that had appeared and later disappeared. Credit-related filings surfaced in places I never expected. Nothing illegal by itself. Nothing dramatic. But together they told a different story than the one he presented at family gatherings. The confident investor. The careful planner. The man who always seemed to have everything under control. One afternoon, I drove past his neighborhood on my way home from an appointment. I was not there to spy. At least that is what I told myself. Yet when I saw the house, I slowed down. The landscaping had been completely redesigned. New stonework lined the front walk. A luxury sport utility vehicle sat beside the pickup truck in the driveway. The improvements looked expensive. Very expensive. I remembered Mom debating whether she could afford to replace a broken dishwasher. The contrast stayed with me all evening. A few days later, Rachel called again. Her voice carried a seriousness I had come to recognize. She explained that additional account records had been reviewed. The transfers were only part of the story. Several account settings had been modified over the years. Contact preferences changed. Security notifications redirected. Access permissions updated. Nearly every adjustment benefited the same person, Daniel. I sat silently while she explained the details. Every new fact seemed to narrow the possible explanations. After hanging up, I drove to Mom's house. She was working on a crossword puzzle when I arrived. For a few minutes we talked about ordinary things. The weather, her garden, a television program she enjoyed. Then she opened a small wooden drawer beside her chair and pulled out an envelope. I found this while cleaning, she said. Inside were birthday cards Daniel had sent over the years. Most contained warm messages, family memories, promises to always look after her. One card caught my attention. It had been written about 3 years earlier. Near the bottom, Daniel had added a handwritten note. Thank you for helping me through a difficult year. I could not have done it without you. Mom frowned. I do not remember helping him financially, she said. Neither did I. Yet the timing matched the period when the transfers began increasing. That night, I added another note to my timeline. More pieces. More questions. Then, just as I prepared to put everything away, my phone buzzed. It was Rachel again. She apologized for the late hour, but said she had found something unusual in the most recent quarterly records. A transaction had been processed only weeks earlier. The amount was larger than any previous transfer. What caught her attention was not the money. It was the attached reference note. Unlike the others, this one had not been generated automatically. Someone had typed it manually. Rachel read the message aloud. The moment I heard those words, every hair on my arm stood up. Because the note contained information only Daniel could have known. After Rachel read the note to me, I sat perfectly still. The message itself was short. Most people would have overlooked it. But I knew immediately why it mattered. The note referenced a conversation about selling a collection of antique fishing reels that had belonged to our father. Those reels had been stored in Mom's attic for years. Only 3 people knew they were there. Mom, me, and Daniel. More importantly, the conversation mentioned in the note had never happened. At least not with Mom. I drove to her house the following morning carrying copies of the newest records. She was sitting at the kitchen table reading the newspaper when I arrived. I showed her the transaction note. She adjusted her glasses and read it twice. Then she slowly shook her head. I never discussed those fishing reels with anyone, she said. I have not even been in the attic in years. Her answer removed the last piece of doubt I had been holding on to. The person who entered that note knew about the reels. The person also assumed the explanation would never be questioned. That realization stayed with me throughout the day. Later that afternoon, Rachel called again. She had continued reviewing archived records connected to the account activity. This time she found something even more significant. The large transfer had been initiated from an online session connected to a specific device profile. While privacy rules limited what information could be shared, she was able to confirm that the device had been used repeatedly over several years to manage changes involving Mom's accounts. The pattern was consistent. The same digital fingerprint appeared again and again. Every time Rachel spoke, the picture became clearer. I spent the evening reviewing my timeline. The transfers, the authorization forms, the witness signatures, the account changes, the reference notes. None of them proved everything by themselves. Together, however, they formed a story that was difficult to ignore. Around 7 o'clock, my phone rang. Daniel. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. He sounded relaxed. Friendly. He asked how Mom was feeling. He asked whether I wanted to meet for lunch sometime next week. Then he casually mentioned that he was planning another trip with Linda later that summer. As he described beachfront views and resort amenities, I found myself looking down at the bank statements spread across my table. The contrast felt impossible to escape. Mom had worried about replacing appliances. Daniel was discussing luxury vacations. Before ending the call, he said something that caught my attention. You know Mom trusts me with everything, he said with a laugh. The sentence was delivered casually, almost carelessly. But after everything I had learned, it sounded different. Once the call ended, I wrote the exact quote into my notes. The next morning brought another development. Rachel informed me that the quarterly statement containing the large transfer had finally been fully processed and archived. A certified copy would be available for review. She suggested I come to the branch in person. When I arrived later that day, she handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was the complete statement. My eyes moved directly to the transfer, then to the note beneath it, and finally to a detail hidden near the bottom of the page. A timestamp, a location marker, and a linked account identifier. For the first time since this began, I was not looking at a suspicion. I was looking at a direct connection. The final statement had done what months of questions could not. It had left a trail that pointed in only one direction. For 2 days, I said nothing. That surprised even me. After everything I had uncovered, after all the documents, the records, the dates, and the explanations that no longer made sense, I still chose silence. Not because I was uncertain, not because I was afraid. I remained silent because I wanted the truth to stand on its own. I wanted Daniel to speak before he knew what I knew. Mom agreed. She was tired of guessing, tired of worrying, tired of feeling confused every time a new piece of information surfaced. We decided to invite everyone to Sunday dinner, just as we had done countless times over the years. The invitation sounded ordinary. Family dinner. Nothing more. Daniel accepted immediately. Linda said they would bring dessert. By Sunday afternoon, Mom's dining room looked exactly as it always had. The same polished table, the same family photographs on the walls, the same grandfather clock ticking steadily in the corner. Yet everything felt different to me. I arrived early carrying a large folder. Inside were copies of every statement, authorization form, account record, timeline summary, and supporting document we had collected. I placed the folder beside my chair and waited. Daniel and Linda arrived shortly before 6 o'clock. They seemed relaxed, comfortable. Daniel even joked about traffic while helping carry a pie into the kitchen. Watching him move through the house so casually made the situation feel even stranger. We sat down together. Dinner began normally. Small talk, stories, comments about the weather. For nearly 30 minutes, nobody mentioned money. Nobody mentioned banks. Nobody mentioned missing savings. Then Mom quietly placed her fork on her plate. The sound seemed louder than it should have. Every conversation stopped. I have a question, she said. Daniel smiled. Sure, Mom. She looked directly at him. Have you been receiving money from my accounts? The smile disappeared. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. Daniel leaned back in his chair. What kind of question is that? He asked. Mom did not answer. Instead, she looked at me. I opened the folder. One by one, I placed copies of the statements on the table. Nobody spoke. Daniel glanced at the pages, then at me, then back at the pages. There is an explanation, he said quickly. I was helping manage things. I nodded. That is what I assumed at first. Then I placed the authorization records beside the statements. His expression tightened slightly. Linda shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Daniel began explaining again. Investments, planning, assistance, administrative convenience. The explanations came faster now. But every explanation collided with another document, another date, another contradiction. Finally, I removed the certified quarterly statement from the folder. The room became completely silent. I slid the page across the table. Please explain this, I said. Daniel studied the document. For the first time all evening, he did not immediately answer. His eyes moved to the transaction note, then to the timestamp, then to the linked account identifier. The color slowly drained from his face. Nobody needed legal training to understand what we were looking at. The statement connected the transfer directly to an account associated with him. Not indirectly, not theoretically, directly. Mom stared at her son. The disappointment in her eyes hurt more than any argument ever could. Daniel opened his mouth as if searching for another explanation. But this time there were no more explanations left. Only evidence. And sitting there at the center of the table, the evidence was finally speaking for itself. Nobody raised their voice after that. In some ways, that made the moment even harder. The grandfather clock continued ticking in the corner. Plates sat untouched on the table. Outside, evening light faded beyond the dining room windows. Inside, the truth had finally arrived, and there was nowhere left for it to go. Daniel stared at the statement for what felt like an eternity. Then he lowered his eyes. Not once did he look at Mom. That hurt her more than any explanation ever could. For years she had defended him, trusted him, believed every story he told. Now she sat quietly across from him, waiting for answers that never seemed to come. Eventually, Daniel spoke. His voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. He admitted that the transfers had started during a difficult financial period. At first, he convinced himself he would pay the money back. Then another problem appeared. Then another. The amounts grew larger. The excuses became easier. Somewhere along the way, temporary borrowing became something else entirely. Linda sat motionless beside him. She looked shocked by some of what she was hearing. Whether she knew part of the truth or none of it, I could not tell. What mattered was that the facts no longer depended on anyone's version of events. The records existed. The timelines existed. The statements existed. Mom listened without interrupting. When Daniel finally stopped speaking, she asked only one question. Why did you not come to me honestly? Daniel looked down at his hands. He never answered. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across decades. It carried every holiday, every birthday, every family dinner that had come before. It carried every moment of trust that had been damaged. A few weeks later, new protections were placed on Mom's accounts. Rachel helped coordinate additional safeguards and monitoring procedures. Professional advisors became involved. Documentation was reviewed. Some funds were recovered. Not all of them, but enough to stabilize Mom's finances and give her peace of mind again. More importantly, she no longer faced the future alone. During those weeks, I spent more time with her than I had in years. We planted flowers in the backyard. We sorted old photographs. We talked about Dad. We talked about family. Sometimes we talked about Daniel. Sometimes we did not. Healing did not happen all at once. It arrived slowly, one ordinary day at a time. As for Daniel, consequences followed him long after that dinner ended. Not because anyone sought revenge. Not because anyone wanted to punish him. Consequences came because trust, once broken, does not automatically rebuild itself. He had to face the reality of what his choices had cost. Not only financially, emotionally, personally, relationally. The damage reached farther than money ever could. Nearly 6 months later, I sat with Mom on her front porch watching the sun set across the neighborhood. The air was cool. Children rode bicycles down the street. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked. Life moved forward the way it always does. Mom looked at me and smiled softly. You know, she said, I kept thinking the worst part was losing the money. She paused and folded her hands in her lap. But it was never the money. I knew exactly what she meant. The money mattered. Of course it did. It represented security, independence, years of careful planning. But what hurt most was discovering that trust had been treated as something expendable. I looked out across the quiet street and thought about everything that had happened. One question at a bank had uncovered years of hidden decisions. One statement had exposed what countless explanations could not hide. In the end, the records told the truth. But the real lesson was simpler than that. Families survive mistakes. Families survive hardships. What they struggle to survive is secrecy, because money can be earned again.